You're about to hear a rebroadcast of Where We Live. It was recorded on June 20th of 2019.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Home ownership is a goal for many Americans, but housing costs can keep that dream out of reach. Coming up, we learn how the city of Baltimore has taken a different approach to helping its residents buy homes in neighborhoods that have long been neglected. Baltimore's chief operating officer for its housing department will join us to talk about its Vacants to Value program. That's later. Now, cities and towns don't like abandoned buildings and overgrown lots impacting the nature of their neighborhoods or impacting property values. These areas are often described as blight. We'll get some context on the term and hear how municipalities have battled the problem, which often affects poor communities. Laura Bliss from CityLab will join us with that. First, we wanted to hear what's happening in Connecticut's Brass City. Waterbury has a rich manufacturing past, but like many northeastern cities, when industry left, so did much of the population. And in areas once bustling with activity, there are now vacant homes and buildings. So what's Waterbury doing to address these abandoned areas? Joining me in studio now is Dan Paish, Community Development Planner for the City of Waterbury. Dan, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Lucy.
Now, I had mentioned your role as the community development planner. You're also a native of Waterbury. So tell us what, in your role, how you've been addressing the issue of blight in the city of Waterbury.
Sure. So in about 2017, the city, along with the Harold Webster Smith Foundation through Webster Bank, worked together, kind of a public-private partnership to figure out, what we do as a comprehensive approach to tackling blight. We have had, in the past and currently a blight task force that works on these issues, but recognizing that citywide we have, dozens of properties, hundreds of properties that are blighted, what do we do moving forward with these properties? And so a study was commissioned, and through that study, one of the recommendations coming out was essentially we need a plan for what we have already in blighted and vacant properties, and what we should be doing moving forward to try to convey them, get them into the hands of either developers or homeowners that can get these properties back online and back to productive use.
When you mentioned blighted properties, describe some of them for us.
Sure.
How many do you have in the city?
Yep. So when you talk about blight, kind of overall, blight is really a type of disease when you think about it. It starts to manifest in certain areas. It can spread if you have it in small doses. And so when you have that disease in your community, you want to figure out how you can contain it. And then when you have it, you want to eliminate it as well. So blight in Waterbury, as you mentioned, we're a post-industrial city, just like many cities and towns in Connecticut. Particularly around and down the Naugatuck Valley, we have towns where we have these three-family houses that were built up around the brass factories. We had so many people at one point in the city that we built these multiplex family houses where you have maybe 6 units in one. And as industry declined, you started to see the people leave. And so we didn't have the need for these large 3-family houses anymore. So they started to get into decline. With that, you start to see boarded up windows. You start to see overgrown lawns. When you get those overgrown lawns, the disease spreads and you have dumping in these lots. So you can get properties that are, may have had a fire 5 years ago that hasn't been addressed. They still have the fire damage, boarded up windows, overgrown grass, and it starts to become an accumulation, which is one of our biggest blight issues in the city and in some of our poorer neighborhoods. So we have an issue. We're trying to address that issue. And we're trying to contain it where it is and trying to be proactive in what we do moving forward.
I understand since you've come on board, you're working on a database to really track where these parcels of land are. We're talking about 15,000 parcels so far to date?
Yeah. So one of the biggest recommendations from the study was essentially, they had come in, we were all in committees, and they asked these separate groups, well, how many blighted properties would you estimate that you have in the city? And we would give numbers off the top of our heads, and we have dedicated staff that have been working on this in the city for decades, but we couldn't give an exact number. So the Center for Community Progress came to us in the final report and said, look, you may want to look at getting an exact number and a final report and kind of saying, this is how many properties we consider blighted. So we're working in the city. We have about 32,000 parcels that we're dealing with citywide. So what we're doing right now is we're going through each and every parcel. So my house is going to be evaluated. Everybody who lives in the city, their house will be evaluated. So we're going through this process of, good, fair, and poor. So far, we're about halfway through. So we've been doing it since February. We have about 15,000 parcels completed already, and we're working toward that 32,000 parcel mark. So I'm proud. That's one of the things that we're working on. We should be getting it done in the next few months. And then when we get that, we'll have an assessment of kind of where we are exactly on, what our housing stock is, where the blighted properties are, how many we have of them, and we can kind of get a total mass of, exactly what we have so that we can start working on strategies to remediate it.
When we talk about vacant or abandoned properties, overgrown lots, some of those properties are essentially abandoned, and no one is taking responsibility for them. But how does the city of Waterbury communicate and work with property owners who may be of a fixed income or they have a condition where they're not able to take care of their home like they once did? So I'm just curious how you work with property owners so that there isn't just the rush to seize a property and then try to remediate it with another owner.
Well, that's an excellent point. And so what we do as a city, we have a very comprehensive approach to how we handle blight. So we have a very, very strong in Waterbury community engagement and community outreach section of our police department. And so when we're dealing with blighted properties, we can assess on a case-by-case basis what's happening on each property. So our blight officers and our blight crew can identify which properties we know that are, just owned by property owners who are not here, or somebody who's been in this house for 40 years. Maybe they can't maintain it to the level that we'd like them to maintain it. But there's different varying levels of, what we look at when we find blighted property. So if we have somebody who's been there for 40 years, we may approach that differently than somebody who, was bought it through tax auction 3 years ago, hasn't done 1 ounce of work on it, and maybe he's sitting on it to wait for rent values to increase in the neighborhood. So we can really take a look at it, and we can have discretion and see, we know our neighbors. I know, and our blight guys know. We know who lives where, and we can definitely have discretion on what we can enforce.
You mentioned that within the police department there's a blight, task force, so to speak, that officers that are working on this particular issue. And does that help with community relations, or can it hamper that depending on how a resident views the police?
Yeah. So I think that again in Waterbury, community relations has been extremely strong for years. We have the Police Athletic League, which is a massive organization in the city. It's really grown over the last few years. And so it's just really taken off. Our current police chief has taken a very large approach in the youth development in the city. And so our community relations officers are the ones that are dealing with the blighted properties. They're the ones that are in the neighborhoods. They're the ones that go to the community groups. And so I, as well, since February, since taking on this role, have gone to different neighborhood groups. And we're just conveying to them and to our residents that we want a better quality of life for them. And so that's why we're doing what we're doing. We want to make sure that if somebody's living next to a vacant property where the lawn may be up to their knees, we want to make sure that is remediated for them so that they can go outside in the summer and not have to deal with rodents or any other issues. So we're making it clear that we're not trying to be punitive. We're just trying to make sure that, our codes are enforced and that we have a better quality of life for all of our neighbors.
This is Where We Live. In studio with me, Dan Paish, Community Development Planner for the city of Waterbury, Connecticut. We're learning how his city and later others are dealing with vacant and abandoned properties. There's different remedies, and depending on where you live, those remedies are different for each municipality. What's interesting about this conversation was a coincidence, but the idea that there's actually 2 bills before the General Assembly that went through. One was signed into law by Governor Lamont, the other one waiting for a signature, and it relates to how municipalities handle blight in their communities. I wanted to talk a little bit about that now with Laura Settelmeyer, who is Director of Blight Remediation for the City of Hartford and a chairperson of the Hartford Land Bank. Laura, welcome to our show.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you for having me.
So can you tell us more about these two particular bills and why they were needed?
Sure. So the one bill that you mentioned that has now been signed into law, now Public Act 19-92, an act concerning abandoned and blighted stewardship, is based heavily off of the Pennsylvania Blighted and Abandoned Conservatorship Act. And the term that we're using here in Connecticut is actually receiver and receivership. So a lot of different terms here, but the concept is generally the same, which is how can we, the community, get access faster to these properties to begin rehabilitation work. In Connecticut especially, we have quite a lengthy foreclosure process. So if we're talking about a bank doing a foreclosure or a municipality performing a blight lien foreclosure or tax lien foreclosure, it can be quite a lengthy process to get to the end of that process. And all you have with respect to these abandoned vacant properties is a different owner. There's no work that's been done yet. It's still vacant, abandoned, and in fact in further deterioration because no work has been done. So the objective of that bill, again now law, is to be able to get access to the property so we can start the rehab work faster, and especially to empower our community development corporations, our local neighborhood groups, to be able to take advantage of, to give them a tool to be able to take control of these properties that are really impacting the quality of life in their neighborhoods.
So, Laura, explain a little bit more. So, with this bill now law for receivership, who can go to court to petition for authority to seize a vacant building or area that, with the hopes of then rehabilitating it?
Sure. So, a couple of different parties can file the action in court to petition the court to appoint a receiver, and the party that files the action doesn't necessarily have to be the party that's appointed the receiver, although that is typically, I think, what you see in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and other cities like Chicago and Baltimore. Someone who can file an action would be potentially an owner of the property if there are multiple owners and they're looking to clean the title there to the property. A municipality could file an action. But the key feature in our law in Connecticut is that a resident or a business or a nonprofit developer group that's operating in the neighborhood can petition the court and be appointed the receiver to take care of the property and stabilize the property.
Certainly, this sounds like a good remedy for municipalities to deal with, say, out-of-state landlords that have really abandoned areas and refuse to keep them up to code and can cause health and crime issues. But when you think about, the other cities and modeling this law, I'm looking at the Pennsylvania conservatorship law that you mentioned. Currently, there's a federal lawsuit based on that law in Pennsylvania where property owners say that they feel like they don't have enough due process or notice to fix up their property before the government can come in and take it away from them. So how does the Connecticut law address those concerns, Laura?
So, Lucy, thank you for bringing that up. That is a very important concern to those of us working in this space, and certainly to those of us in Hartford. And so, what we have done with the law is that there are a couple of opportunities in which the property owner gets notice. So, and one of the changes actually that we made to the Connecticut law that's different than the Pennsylvania law is that any owner of a property has to be named as a party in the action, as opposed to Pennsylvania, where they are given notice of the action and have the option to intervene, which I'm not familiar with the case that you mentioned, but could possibly be the source of some frustration with owners if they didn't intervene initially. They might not be getting notice of future actions in that case. Whereas in Connecticut, they would actually be named a party in the action, so they would get notice not simply at the beginning when the action is filed, but also at every step along the way. I'll also say, our objective with a tool like receivership, and it's similar to the new anti-blight and property maintenance ordinance that we passed in Hartford 2 years ago. Our objective really is to be able to identify those property owners who do want to step up and do the right thing, and when that happens, to get out of their way as quickly as possible so as not to frustrate their purposes, and in fact be able to connect them to the resources they need so that they can retain ownership of the property and maintain it and be able to continue doing so. And my hope is that the same would happen with receivership here too, that if and there is that opportunity. Now that is similar to Pennsylvania, that there's the opportunity for the owner to step forward and say, no, I would like to do the right thing here. I would like a chance to rehab the property. And then we can stop the receivership and allow the owner to get to work so that not only is there enough due process and notice to the owners, but there's also an opportunity for them to do the work themselves and for the government and the courts to get out of the way and allow them to do so.
I wanted to transition back to my in-studio guest, Dan Paish, again, Community Development Planner for the City of Waterbury. Waterbury's Mayor O'Leary, as well as Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin, both supported the stewardship bill that Laura just mentioned, but also a land bank bill. This is something that your office has been working on specifically, Dan. What is that, and how would that work?
Yep. So right now in the city of Waterbury, if we have property that we own, whether we took that through tax foreclosure or it was a property that had a fire years ago and we had ownership of the lot, right now if we want to dispose of that property, if we want to get it into the hands of maybe a fair housing development agency or nonprofit development agency, we'd have to go through our formal process as adopted by our Board of Aldermen. And so when you go through that process, it does get our properties through. So it can get them into the hands of a developer or an interested neighbor who wants to take care of an adjoining lot. But they have to go through the process of our legal process to get it from the city. So it can get confusing for some of these neighbors who just want to take a side property that they've been dealing with for years that's been, overgrown. And now they want to take and add it to their tax bill and at minimal cost to them. So we have done that. So we've gone through the RFP, request for proposals process, and we've gotten property out of the city's hands into the neighbors' hands so that they can take care of property. What a land bank would do would be to make it easier for this entire process to happen. So now we would have kind of less confusing documents in front of people, so they wouldn't have to necessarily look at, legal documents that maybe they won't know how to complete and have to go through our entire purchasing process. A land bank would streamline the process essentially. And now that we would take a property and put it into a land bank, we can then have one pot of money to market that property, to show the property, to hold on to it. And then once we're ready, convey it to another organization that can take it, either put a clean, safe, affordable housing in some of these neighborhoods or maintain a lot in the case of a neighbor.
When we think about how a city or town makes a decision of who then gets the property to redevelop, is the intent with the land bank as well is that you're looking at community organizations that are vested in the city of Waterbury?
Correct. Yep. So in my title in community development, that's essentially what it is, Lucy, is we're trying to make sure that our development in these neighborhoods is community-based. And so that is why, we've been going to these neighborhood associations. That's why when we get to a point in a property, when we're ready to sell a property from our inventory, from the city, we look at who we want to sit on a selection committee to select the next owner of the lot. We'll bring in a community leader. So they're sitting at the table with the city officials, and they have a say on, I know that on this property we've had vice issues in the future. Yeah. So whoever takes this property should be somebody who, has two-family housing in mind, because we have, a need for housing in this neighborhood. But we may want to see a parking variance. So we may want to see them provide parking so that we don't have on-street parking. That is input from the community that, maybe we don't necessarily know because we're not living on that street every day. So we bring community members to the table as part of these selection committees to figure out who the next owner is of these properties.
Laura Settlemeyer is with us on the phone, again, Director of Blight Remediation for the City of Hartford and chairs the Hartford Land Bank. How's it been working so far in Hartford, Laura?
Thanks for asking, Lucy. So we set up our land bank almost 2 years ago now in 2017. As a result, we were very fortunate to get a grant from the State Department of Housing back in 2016 to seed a land bank for the city of Hartford. And we are working with other partners like the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving to build upon that grant and to create a land bank here in Hartford that we hope will be active later this summer and fall. And similar to what Dan is saying in Waterbury, the idea is to provide a specialized tool or resource for both the city and the community. And I have to emphasize here that I always say that, a land bank really cannot work effectively unless there is genuine, robust community engagement, that the land bank is very much a tool for the community, working with the community as much as it is a tool for the municipality itself. And the idea is to come up with strategies for these properties where truly no one is stepping up to the plate to take responsibility, that effectively the market has rejected, and to get control of the properties and to figure out what is the precise issue that is causing no one to step up to the plate. Is it environmental concerns? Is it title issues? Are there just so many liens on the properties that you just can't make sense of who owns what and who has first priority? Or is there, a partially collapsed structure on the property that needs to come down before construction can begin? And the idea is for the land bank to isolate those issues and perform that work that's necessary to generate a pipeline of properties for local neighborhood developers to come in and pick up the properties and take it to completion, whether that's developing quality, affordable housing or whatever is in line with the community objectives and priorities.
And you expect Governor Lamont to sign this bill into law, Laura?
Yes, we do. Yes.
Well, we appreciate you explaining to us exactly what these two specific legislation that passed through the General Assembly this session, what they will do for municipalities. But I want to thank Laura Settelmeyer, again, Director of Blight Remediation for the City of Hartford, for joining us today. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Lucy.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Dan Paish is in studio with me, Community Development Planner for the City of Waterbury. Coming up, we're going to continue talking about how communities handle vacant and abandoned buildings, often described as blight. And we're going to learn more about the context of blight that's been used through the years as communities consider redevelopment. I just wanted to read a tweet from Aaliyah. She wrote, "Thrilled to hear today's show on Waterbury, a.k.a. the dirty water, a.k.a. my hometown. There's been a status quo of no interest to not address blight in certain neighborhoods. That's their problem attitude. Glad to hear about changes and outreach to the community." This is Where We Live. We'll be back right after a short break.
You're listening to a rebroadcast of Where We Live. It was originally recorded on June 20th, 2019.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We've been hearing how cities like Waterbury, Connecticut and Hartford have been addressing vacant and abandoned properties, often described as blight. In studio with me, Dan Paish, Community Development Planner for the City of Waterbury. Now, the term blight is used widely, even by the president.
I will also propose tax holidays for inner-city investment, a new tax incentive to get foreign companies to relocate in blighted American neighborhoods, and they will do that. It will be worthwhile. It's called incentive. They will do it.
That's from a Bloomberg Politics video of Mr. Trump speaking back in 2016 about his New Deal for Black America. Now, we wanted to know more about how blight has been used by communities over the years to justify redevelopment in certain areas. For that context, joining us via Skype is Laura Bliss, West Coast Bureau Chief for CityLab. Laura, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I heard my earlier guest, Dan, describe a blight as disease in a neighborhood. That's essentially where the word comes from.
That's correct. Yeah, this is a term that urban reformers and local leaders have been using to refer to the kind of condition of neighborhoods and cities since the 19th century. And gardeners are probably pretty familiar with the term too, because that's where it comes from, right? It's actually a term that was originally used to refer to disease in crops and in plants. And it really started being used in the sort of urban context at a time when kind of early social scientists were looking around at cities and trying to understand the kind of growing social problems that they were observing, coinciding with population growth and industry and dense housing, and trying to kind of understand it through scientific terms. And so they came up with this term. They sort of transferred this term from the agricultural and kind of gardening word blight to describe this kind of growing menace, as they put it, and similar to kind of how some of the other folks on the show described it, right? This thing that creeps from something like, a broken window or a deteriorated house to, more trash in the street or other kinds of damaged property. And even we've kind of seen it linked to crime and other kinds of unwanted behavior in urban spaces.
When people hear the term blight, they often think about when a city or a town moves in to either raise that property and to bring in a different development, that then leads to gentrification.
Yeah, and I would point out too that, even before we get to gentrification, right, blight, that term, so kind of going back, turning the dial back on history a little bit, right, we see it started being used in the late 19th century, early 20th century, indeed as kind of a pretext for explaining why, or for sort of winning over arguments, right, about why certain neighborhoods should be redeveloped. And it's definitely became an important term in the kind of urban renewal programs of the 1950s and 60s, where we had federal grants going to cities that were, in some cases, experiencing population decline and in others not, to actually displace what were often immigrant neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color, and to raise their properties, right, and to create new stuff in their place. I think Hartford is actually an example of this, as is New York and Chicago and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and many, many, many other major American cities.
I'm actually from the Pittsburgh area, and a really good example of a city using a blight designation to uproot thousands was the gutting of the historic Hill District. This was predominantly African-American community that there were lots of jazz and culture. Everyone knows August Wilson grew up there, wrote Fences, and the city of Pittsburgh uprooted thousands of African-Americans and actually led to the decline of that particular neighborhood that the city of Pittsburgh is still trying to figure out how to redevelop today, Laura.
Yeah, that's right. Right. We're kind of experiencing this second wave of downtown regeneration. And in many ways, you're absolutely right. It's not just Pittsburgh, but other cities too, sort of grappling with the effects of having replaced what were at one point densely packed neighborhoods with, office parks and hospitals, which like community centers of other kinds, which are great, but take up large swaths of land and don't have the same kind of concentration of people and kind of life. So yeah, it is to say that, the term has been used to mean a lot of different things over the last 100+ years. And that there is, because it is so closely tied with these processes of urban transformation that are closely tied with immigrant neighborhoods and African-American neighborhoods and later on Latino neighborhoods, that it can be a loaded term too. When it's used a little bit too loosely, I think it has at times been fraught with those kind of racial implications as well.
Because of what you just mentioned, Laura, some urban planners have called for cities and others to not even use the term blight, to come up with an alternative term. Has that gone anywhere? Yeah, that's right. There was an urban planner, Justin Garrett Moore, who's prominent in the New York City area, who kind of proclaimed in a 2015 essay that we need that new word. And his point is largely kind of what we were just discussing, right? That it is
on the one hand, this incredibly ubiquitous term that city planners everywhere use to describe real things, right, and real problems in their cities, right, deteriorating properties and things that really need to be addressed to intervene with declining property values and even the health, right, of local residents. But on the other hand, it's kind of fraught with all these loaded terms, and it can be sometimes so vague to the point of not even being incredibly useful, right? So he does kind of call for a separate term. And no, I don't think that effort has really gone anywhere because it is such a ubiquitous term at this point. But I think the sort of interesting point about his essay and this argument, which is not just his, but has definitely come from others as well, is that, where possible, kind of using the term as specifically as possible and to use it to describe properties, right, or actual space rather than kind of broadly and amorphously to possibly describe entire neighborhoods full of people is key.
Laura Bliss is joining us via Skype. She's a West Coast Bureau Chief for CityLab today as we talk more about blight and what it means, the context behind the term, and how cities and towns across America have used that term as a reason to redevelop particular parts of communities. In studio with me is Dan Paish, Community Development Planner for the City of Waterbury. Dan, how do you work with community members who may be concerned about displacement or gentrification in certain neighborhoods of Waterbury?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a very fair point. And even in the 1960s, when we were building our highways, we split them through our cities and we split them through, neighborhoods that were generally poor and immigrant-based. So there's that fair, and that's a justifiable fair. I also think when you bring up the term community engagement, a lot of times that's meant, that you maybe hold one meeting at City Hall for the residents to check mark, a stipulation as part of a study that you have to require community engagement. And I think that's the wrong way to approach it. What we've done in Waterbury is tried to go directly to the neighborhoods. Instead of holding a hearing for them, where we present our plan and then go away, we want to be active in their neighborhoods. So we want to go to their community centers. We want to hear, what their issues are day to day, what they think their needs are. Again, I mentioned parking. That's been an issue in Waterbury where maybe in the winter months when you're parking on the streets get so narrow that it's hard to pass through. So one of the comments that we get from neighbors in different neighborhoods in Waterbury is, if you're going to bring in a multifamily housing unit, we want to see a plan of parking development. And so they let us know what they want to see in the neighborhood so that we're not coming in with a firm fist and saying, here's what you're going to have and this is what you're going to deal with. We want to make sure that they have the loudest voice in the process because they're the ones that live their day to day. And I agree 100%. And I think that whenever you go in to a neighborhood and you kind of dictate what the issue, the resolution of an issue should be, I think that's the wrong way to approach it. I think you should hear from them on what the resolution should be, and I think you should work alongside them to achieve that goal. And so, what we like to see is safe, affordable housing in these neighborhoods. We're not necessarily looking for a developer in some of our inner city neighborhoods to come in and put market rate or high priced apartments in these neighborhoods. We want to see it in line with what the income is. Now that I mentioned earlier in the broadcast that we had 3 family houses that because of the decline of industry, we lost population. We're starting to see that population grow again in Waterbury. Our schools are bursting at the seams. And a lot of those are renters. So they may not be buying homes, but they're living in apartments. So we're starting to see swell back into our city, and specifically our inner cities, for people who are getting pushed out of different areas. Maybe they're getting pushed out of the Bronx because their rents are getting higher in the Bronx. Or, they're getting pushed out in New Haven, and they're moving up to Waterbury, and they're using our school systems. And so we're starting to see a housing need again. And so we're trying to be as responsive as possible to what they want to see in their neighborhoods and what they want as, their quality of life continues to improve.
Describe the demographics that you're talking about, people that are moving back into Waterbury's downtown. I understand post-university has a place at the table there with attracting people into the city of Waterbury. But if you're talking about people in their 20s, young people, cities want young people to come back.
Right.
Do they want to be living in an apartment in a 3-family home? Are they looking for, some more hip housing, so to speak?
Right. So right now in downtown specifically, we are starting to see an influx, again, of employees into our downtown, which to us is tremendous because for years, the building that post-university, just to give a little bit of a background to that, that was a former department store, which had been closed since 1997. So, Lucy, I was 5 years old when it closed, and it had sat vacant since then. And last December, we've had an influx of 400 employees that are working there now. They're working in admissions. They're working in call centers. Post-university has a major online presence in online learning. And now those people are going out to lunch. They're going to dinner. It used to be for years in downtown Waterbury, at 5:01, the sidewalks would be empty and it'd be a long line to Route 8 or 84 so they could get back home to their suburban houses. We're starting to see a difference in that now. At 5:30, you start to see people out at bars. You start to see more market rate apartments in more mixed use development in downtown. So now a lot of people are living in our downtowns. And for many years, we're not displacing anybody because the top floors of a lot of these properties were storage and former office space. So we're seeing conversion into apartments in downtown, which is very interesting because for many years, Waterbury didn't have this mixed use component. So now you're starting to see life again on a Saturday. So, which I had never seen before. So it's a beautiful thing to see.
Before we head to break, Dan, I did want to ask you, where is the city of Waterbury looking, whether it's in the Northeast or other places around the country, as a model for what you're hoping to achieve?
Sure. So at the end of July, a team of us from Waterbury are going to go visit Newburgh, New York, because they have a land bank actually set up. New York had the legislation set. So we're going to go take a tour of Newburgh. We're going to see what they're doing well on the land bank legislation that they had there, to see how it's working in practicality, and we can see what we take back with us back to Waterbury so that we're successful from day one. A lot of times, because we have cities that are similar to us, and the Northeast is filled with cities like Waterbury, we can see what has been done right and what's been done wrong, maybe more importantly, so that moving forward we can make adjustments and make it work for us.
Well, Dan, we appreciate you coming up to Hartford to explain what's happening in the city of Waterbury. Again, Dan is Community Development Planner for Waterbury, Connecticut. Dan, thanks again.
Thank you, Lucy.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we're going to learn about another model for communities. This is the city of Baltimore that has a unique program that goes beyond just raising abandoned buildings. And Laura Bliss from CityLab will stay with us as well. And you can join the conversation, too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
You're listening to a rebroadcast of Where We Live. It was originally recorded on June 20th, 2019.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Home ownership is a goal for many Americans, but housing costs can keep that dream out of reach. Now, the city of Baltimore has taken a different approach to helping its residents buy homes in neighborhoods that have seen neglect. Baltimore's chief operating officer for its Department of Housing is joining us now to talk about a unique program. It's called Vacants to Value. Jay Green, welcome to our show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I should also mention Laura Bliss, who's a writer for CityLab. She's the West Coast Bureau Chief, is with us as well via Skype. Jay, so tell us about how Baltimore has dealt with blighted properties.
Well, our Vacants to Value has been a cornerstone program for us, but recently we've begun to build off of that program and kind of expand how we do and how we approach community development. Basically, our Vacants to Value, a V2V program, it's a way to try to get city-owned properties in the hands of developers, small developers, and people who are interested in purchasing property for home ownership or even revitalizing the property for rental as quickly as possible in some of our more distressed neighborhoods.
So if you have abandoned properties, the city of Baltimore, you use receivership to access those properties, and then you're able to then sell them at a good discount to residents?
Yes, receivership is an additional kind of tool that we have. It's primarily a code enforcement tool where we issue citations to property owners who are neglecting their properties. And if they don't respond, we take legal action and put it into our receivership program. The receivership program, we have a not-for-profit receiver who then auction off the property and to a different owner who's interested in rehabbing that property. And we've been very successful with that program, and it's one of the largest receivership programs in the country. And combined with our Vacants to Value program, we've seen success in revitalizing some of our more difficult neighborhoods.
We heard from a woman who works for the city of Hartford talking about a law that Connecticut has just signed into law, actually a bill that essentially helps municipalities gain or have the authority to seize certain property for redevelopment. And she mentioned that it wasn't just about switching hands, because you don't want to then give it to someone who will then let it remain blighted for years and years. And so there's a timing mechanism for the value vacant to values program, where if somebody does purchase this property, they have to do something with it in a certain amount of time.
Yeah, for the Vacants to Value, we actually make them fill out an application, and we vet the applicant, in terms of their resources and their plans. So we try to do this all within, make sure that it's back on the market within a 12-month period. So we do a lot of vetting beforehand, and like I said, in terms of what the plans of the developers, what the plans are, and what their resources are to accomplish that plan.
Again, Jay Green is Chief Operations Officer, for the City of Baltimore's Department of Housing and Community Development. We're learning about a unique program there that deals with blight and also redevelopment. The Vacants to Value program launched in 2010. How has the city changed, Jay?
Well, we've seen some success in a number of our neighborhoods, and we have recently come out with a new era of neighborhood investment, and it's a framework for our future community development. And what we're trying to do now is to build on the strengths of our neighborhoods, where the Vacants to Value and other programs have been successful in revitalizing some of our neighborhoods, and continue to build on that strength that's been created through revitalization and the programs like V2B and our receivership program.
And then how do you address concerns about gentrification, Jay?
Well, part of our process is very community-based. We get community buy-in with our plans and how we approach community development. Our citizens definitely are concerned about displacement, and so part of our policies include equity. We allow equity and inclusion of existing residents and what we call legacy residents who live in these neighborhoods for a long time. So we try to develop policies that keep them in place. We have home ownership programs. We have renovation programs that help them to stay in place. So we deal with these issues largely through community engagement.
Laura Bliss is with us via Skype. She's the West Coast Bureau Chief for CityLab. Laura, you've been hearing a little bit about Baltimore's Vacants to Value program. Other cities like Detroit have also come up with different ways of dealing with neglected neighborhoods, bringing people back, giving them the opportunity to purchase homes. What can you tell us?
Yeah, absolutely. Detroit is kind of the poster child. They've, in addition to having a pretty substantial abandoned property problem, they've also been pretty innovative over the last 5 years or so in how they're dealing with that. And that includes like crowdsourcing efforts to get residents involved in reporting abandonment and blighted houses as well through what they call a Blacksting service, a blight texting service. And that's kind of adding into a database that's transparent and available online. And through the collection of that data, it sounds like Hartford is engaged in a similar process, right? That lets the city kind of figure out, where the properties are and then kind of engage in a strategic process of figuring out, what to do with them. And that's something we've also seen repeated in Chicago, right? I mean, it's another city that's been offering up empty lots for as little as $1 and up from there on auction. Other cities that have other kinds of innovative programs are Philadelphia. This is actually a city that's had for decades a strong partnership with a local horticultural group. So going back to that history of blight as a gardening term, it's kind of interesting. But so they're gardening society, right? These are volunteers, have for decades been involved in kind of taking over abandoned lots and setting up community gardens on them. And they've actually, because that program is so longstanding, they've actually been able to do research on some of the positive impacts of that, and just a little bit of greening they found has been able to increase property values and curb gun crime to some extent. Jacksonville, Florida has an ordinance similar, I think, to what Connecticut is talking about, or Hartford rather, allowing the city to demolish abandoned homes. I reported a story about a year ago in Columbus, Ohio, where a local hospital is actually working closely with the city to renovate abandoned and deteriorating housing as a sort of community health intervention, right? Because there's sort of a growing body of research that shows how important kind of neighborhood surroundings are to different kinds of health factors. Yeah, I mean, every city really has, although many cities were affected by the same kind of macro trends that we're talking about depopulation, throughout the 20th century, and in some cases this urban renewal trend that we also saw in the middle of the 20th century that cities are trying to grapple with. Each city is different, right? And so-called blight looks different in each place. And so I think each city has its own kind of strategy too.
We should note we've been focusing a lot on how municipalities turn over blight into housing, oftentimes affordable housing or new housing, but cities and towns are using old spaces for new ideas. As you mentioned, parks, there's pop-up markets, farmers markets, as well as turning viaducts and rail lines into urban gardens. We don't have to look further than Manhattan's High Line for that being a success. But it has been an interesting conversation to learn about these different models of cities and towns tackling blight in their communities. I want to thank Laura Bliss, who's the West Coast Bureau Chief for CityLab. She joined us today via Skype. Laura, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Also with us, Jay Green, Chief Operations Officer for the City of Baltimore's Department of Housing and Community Development, telling us more about the Vacants to Value program in Baltimore. Jay, thank you.
Thank you.
Today's show produced by senior producer Lydia Brown. Our technical producer is Kion Wolf. And on the phones today is WNPR intern Jesse Steinmetz. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. As always, thanks for listening.